Section 2.2 covers the authorization of collective investment schemes. Now, this is absolutely central to paper 6 in that if you are offering a collective investment scheme, a mutual fund, a unit trust, to the Hong Kong investing public, you must have that scheme authorized by the Securities and Futures Commission. So that is just an overriding point of all the material. Now, if we move down a couple of bullet points, we're told the SFC may, for both the advertisement and the offering, grant authorization subject to additional conditions, withdraw authorization once given, and we consider that in topic 3. And indeed, the SFC can refuse authorization. And then a couple of points down, the SFC must approve all advertisements, invitation documents which invite the public to enter into an agreement to acquire, dispose of, subscribe for, or underwrite securities, enter into a regulated investment agreement, acquire an interest in or participate in a collective investment scheme. So advertisements, invitations, documents, etc. must be approved, authorized by the SFC. Now, interestingly, the documents that are exempt from the SFC authorization, and often it's easier to write a question about exemptions rather than what authorization is. Prospectus is complying with the company's ordinance. That's to do with listings. And then it goes on to expand listing and other documents approved by Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing do not need to be authorized by the SFC. Documents issued by certain licensed corporations for securities holders of type 145 finance. They're not going to go into that amount of detail. But the next one I would remember: advertisements for securities or collective investment schemes which will only be sold to professional investors. If that is the case, then SFC authorization is not required. The SFC is there to protect the Hong Kong investing public. And the following bullet point, an interesting one: sellers or publishers of newspapers containing advertisements in ordinary course of business are excluded from liability. Well, just any potential liability of not having the advert authorized. No, sellers, publishers of newspapers, the conduit, they do not themselves need the authorization. It's whoever is placing the advert. Then we have material on misrepresentation, a number of bullet points, and then we have 3 SFO definitions with regard to misrepresentation: fraudulent misrepresentation, negligent misrepresentation, and reckless misrepresentation. Have a read through those, an outside chance that something could come up. And then we have a few bullet points there on authorization of structured products. Yes, the SFC also will authorize structured products, but not something that is heavily examined. Now, something that's relatively new in Hong Kong and is starting to attract a number of questions at paper 6 is open-ended fund companies. This is section 2.3 on page 11. And if we look at the first bullet point, SFO, the ordinance, provides for the creation and regulation of open-ended fund companies. These are vehicles for collective investment schemes with limited liability and variable share capital, providing them flexibility to meet investor applications and redemptions. Now, there are some vehicles that are provided with the offshore finance centres being an obvious location, structures for funds. And Hong Kong is now sort of getting in on the game by introducing these open-ended fund companies, and they hope these to be attractive to funds in Hong Kong. As it says, OFCs are a form of collective investment scheme, and therefore they're a very strong target for paper 6. Now, I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because I think it's important you get to grips with it. Core aspects of this legislative provision include: it is an offence punishable by fine or imprisonment to carry on as an OFC without being SFC registered. So you must register your open-ended fund company with the SFC. As you will see, you have to actually go through the SFC to get the company set up. Key requirements for incorporation, naming, registration of an OFC are in the legislation. How shares are to be issued, redeemed, priced, administration and operation of an OFC, including details of directors, investors. Well, that's the same really for any type of collective investment scheme. An OFC's disclosure and reporting obligation and governance standards to be complied with, and SFC regulatory powers regarding the OFCs. All of that is in the legislation and the Securities and Futures Ordinance. So please be aware that this is a new vehicle in Hong Kong for collective investment schemes, the concept of open-ended fund companies, limited liability companies. And the concept is covered elsewhere in this material. The last bullet point indicates the SFC has the power to make subsidiary legislation and issue codes and guidelines regarding the OFCs. And indeed, the SFC has. So we will see in topic 2, we'll be covering the open-ended fund companies rules. And in topic 3, we'll look at the code on open-ended fund companies. Section 2.4 looks at the regulatory rules. Well, it's really the codes and guidelines, sort of loosely referring to them as rules issued by the SFC. Important ones that you need to be aware of: the Code of Conduct, Internal Control Guidelines, and Guideline on Anti-Money Laundering, Counter-Terrorist Financing. Remember, these are not legislation. So if you're breaching any of these, you're not breaking the law. Now let's have a look at the different codes that have been issued with regard to asset management, collective investment schemes, and MPF products. We've got the Fund Manager Code of Conduct. That is central to Paper 6 and will be dealt with in topic 3. The SFC's Handbook, and that covers a range of issues, including some of the codes. Code and unit trusts and mutual funds is central with regard to getting your collective investment scheme authorized, and we deal with that in topic 3 in a great deal of depth. Code and real estate investment trusts, if it's going to be examined, one question, and there's a section on that in topic 3. The SFC code on MPF products, this is an SFC code, obviously, with regard to MPF products. So, as I said earlier, the SFC acts as the gatekeeper for investment products going into the public markets in Hong Kong. And so, although MPF schemes are supervised and authorized by the Mandatory Provident Fund Authority, with regard to the products, the schemes that they put out into the market, the SFC must approve them. And then we have the OFC code. We've just looked at open-ended fund companies, and this code we deal with in topic 2. And then there's some sundry notes on codes of conduct, guidelines, etc., that I have already referred to. Section 2.5 goes into the Mandatory Provident Fund Schemes Ordinance in a little bit more detail. Tells us that the ordinance provides for the establishment of the scheme's creation of the authority, and a number of other points. 3 main pieces of subsidiary legislation that helped with regard to setting up mandatory provident fund schemes. There's the general regulation exemption that exempts occupational retirement scheme ordinance schemes from complying with the MPF regulations, and the fees regulation looking at fees for MPF schemes. The MPFA itself has issued 2 codes, the Code on MPF investment funds and the Code on disclosure of MP investment funds. I think there's far more chance of being tested on the SFC codes than on the MPFA codes. And then we referred to this earlier on section 2.6, Occupational Retirement Schemes Ordinance. This covered voluntary retirement schemes in Hong Kong prior to the establishment of the managed provident fund schemes. So pre-2000, we had the ORSO schemes. Some of the ORSO schemes still exist, and the MPFA actually now oversees ORSO schemes as well. Moving on to section 3, the regulators. Now, we've looked at this in paper 1. If you've done paper 1, this is very much revision. And the main regulator is the Securities and Futures Commission, with Chairman, Chief Executive Officer and directors. Now, the main operational units of the SFC are now listed, and I want to highlight a couple of points. First one is within the investment product division, and that is the division that authorizes collective investment schemes. It also, the fourth bullet point, registers open-ended fund companies. So if you are looking to create an open-ended fund company for a collective investment scheme, you must register with the investment product division of the SFC. Then we have the intermediaries division, and that looks at licensing and supervisory visits of intermediaries. And we list the details of the two departments. Then supervision of markets division. Remember, the markets being the stock exchange, the futures exchange, the SFC supervises. It does not administer the listing process and the trading activities of the stock exchanges. I would like to point out the second last bullet point under the markets division. It oversees the investor compensation fund, and we'll be dealing with investor compensation fund later. Corporate finance division, although the SFC is not involved in the listing process in the stock exchange, it is very much involved in the world of takeovers and mergers, and it has issued codes and will administer those codes through the corporate finance division. And finally, the enforcement division, the division that investigates and inspects and enforces the laws. Now, section 3.1.2, committees, panels and tribunals of the SFC. Now, we're going to look at those that concern asset management. The Product Advisory Committee, now this is within the SFC. It gives advice with regard to new products coming on the market. It's purely advisory, as it says. Then we have the Committee on Real Estate Investment Trust. That's part of the SFC and oversees the overall development of REITs in Hong Kong. And then the Securities and Futures Appeals Tribunal, that tribunal is independent of the SFC. The first two are part of the SFC, but the third one listed there, Securities and Futures Appeals Tribunal, that's tribunal you appeal to if you do not like a ruling out of the SFC. Please remember, it is independent of the SFC. Now we come to page 16, section 3.2, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Now, Hong Kong Monetary Authority supervises the registered institutions. The first few bullet points with regard to the HKMA reflects the fact that it supervises the banking industry and everything that goes with that. But for the SFC papers, we have to understand the relationship between the HKMA and the SFC with regard to supervision and regulation. Now, if we look at the diagram on the left-hand side, authorized financial institutions, AFIs, are supervised by the HKMA. That's their banking supervision role. All banks are AFIs, but not all AFIs are banks. So money changers, for example, Western Union, are AFIs, but they're not banks. Now, we're interested in those that carry out an SFC regulated activity. And the regulated activity we're looking at in paper 6 is asset management. So if you have a bank that's involved in asset management, it must register with the SFC and is known as a registered institution. On the other hand, if you're an asset manager and you're not a bank, you will be supervised by the SFC and known as a licensed corporation. Both licensed corporations and registered institutions are collectively known as intermediaries. Now, it's very important that you are familiar with that terminology. It's definitions from the Securities and Futures Ordinance, and the exam will refer to registered institutions, licensed corporations, and intermediaries.